Welcome to my kitchen. It's been a couple of weeks and I had intended to start a new batch of Kyphi on the new moon. And then I started doing a little digging and found, first of all, that we had a full lunar eclipse today, and also discovered some interesting associations with full versus new moon, and decided that in the light of what's been going on in the world lately, a Kyphi batch that is aimed toward protection would be probably a good vintage to experiment with. So today we are starting the very first step of creating this new batch. And as with the previous Kyphi blends, once we are completed with the 10 days worth of steps that go into this whole process, it'll be probably in this case sometime in October before this is fully cured and ready to go out into the world. But that's why we started now. It is a powerful and auspicious day if you are one to make note of such things. The full lunar eclipse was a little bit ago today, so we don't get to see it over in this part of the world. But there's a couple of changes that I've made to this specific recipe. So traditional Kyphi, and particularly the recipe that I've been working with that is recorded on the walls of the laboratory room in the Edfu Temple complex, is a sacred incense burned in the evening as part of the worship, and it is intended to uh, invite visions and dreams and sort of like throw wide the gates of the imagination. And of course, in the ancient world, visions and dreams were two of the primary pathways for communication with the spirit world and with the gods. Uh, Drawing also upon the mythology and the iconography of ancient Egypt, I have been playing around with what alterations in those ingredients will retain the overall feel and luxurious scent of Kyphi, but direct it toward a slightly different purpose and goal. One that is no less sacred, but one that is perhaps very needed right now. If, like me, you've been keeping up with what's going on in the world and you're feeling a little overwhelmed, uh, a little uncertain about what the future may hold. Obviously, for more than just the pandemic, feeling inspired by the plight of people that parts of our society still view as outcasts, as undeserving of the same treatment and position as the encircled bits of society. I thought it would be appropriate to make this blend of incense, this Kyphi batch, not only for the full lunar eclipse, but dedicate it to the spirit of the ancient Egyptian god Set. Now, if you are familiar with Set from the mythology that we widely hear once Egypt had become Hellenized, and so Set, as he became a Hellenized deity, especially in Egypt of the Ptolemies, he's kind of a bad guy. Okay, not just kind of, he's probably one of the, if not the direct inspiration for the Christian concept of Satan. Probably also the Jewish one too. He's a really complicated guy, but it's mostly because he's gotten a bad rap. So that Set, the Set who becomes associated with the Greek serpent Typhon, the Set who is seen as the god of chaos and destruction, that's not the guy I'm talking about. No, I want to spool time backwards by several thousand years to a very different version of this god. He was a controversial being, especially as things moved toward the Hellenic occupation and sacredization of Egypt. but long ago, even for the Egyptians at that time, he was the twin of Horus, and he and Horus, Horus the elder, not Horus the younger. That's complicated and probably a whole other thing by itself. Um, they started off as twins and representations of the polar forces that kept the universe in dynamic balance. You couldn't have one without the other. And each of them had lunar associations, Horus with the new moon and Set with the full moon. There's some connections to their eyes, connections to Set and another nifty god, Tahuti or Toth. And Set back then, particularly the myth that I'm drawing upon for this incense, and it's why I wanted to say it is for protection during the dark hours. The oldest versions of Set, he was also called Great of Strength. He was one of the only gods, really the only god, who was strong enough, powerful enough, and brave enough to stand on the prow of the boat of the sun god as he passed through the dark hours of the night in the underworld. And there were many things that would attempt to attack the sun and his retinue as he passed from his death at sunset to his hopeful rebirth at dawn. None of the things that threatened him were worse than a being called Apep or Apophis. Notably, Apophis ends up getting kind of like mishmashed with Typhon, and the reason that Set and Typhon, and Set is a Typhonian being once we get to Ptolemaic Egypt, is somehow he became conflated with the being that he fought. We can go into that later. In the old mythology, Set stood at the prow with his spear tipped with iron, meteoric iron, because he had associations with meteorites. And when this great serpent, longer than anyone could see, would try to grasp the bark of the sun god in its coils in an effort to crush it and then devour the sun before it could be reborn, Set was the one who faced off with the serpent, stabbed it with his spear, and protected the sun in the dark hours so that it would not be lost, so that Ra would not be destroyed, so that Ra could be born again exactly as he had been. And this journey through 12 hours of night was thought to play out over and over and over again every time the sun went down. And yes, I know that there's 12 hours here and 12 hours there, and they're never so neat as that.
Only 2 days a year.
Yes, but so those dark hours of the night are when Set stood up and faced off this being that was chaos and destruction and dissolution and the devouring of self. Apep or Apophis is probably one of the only beings in Egyptian mythology that we can describe as wholly evil. He didn't have anybody who followed him. He didn't have, as far as we know, any temples dedicated to him. He didn't start off as a good guy who got turned into a bad guy, which is definitely the story of Set. Apep, in a lot of ways, is similar to, if you're familiar with Sumerian and Babylonian mythology, the dragon Tiamat, who existed before everything else and was a representation of the chaos of formlessness and the sort of entropy that threatens to always devour society and civilization around on its edges. In the case of Apophis / Apep, what that being was seeking to devour was being itself, the very identity of the sun god, so that he could not be reborn. Basically wanted to swallow his soul. A number of changes that I've made into this is I wanted something that was still kept, obviously, the dried fruit and wine and honey base. Those are essential to this style of incense. But one of the big changes is figs. So the first batch of Kyphi that I made last year, I used dates as the main base. The vintage I made just, a month ago? Yeah, May. Wow.
Yeah. Not even.
Yeah, not even a month ago. I used raisins as the base. The translation, most of them say raisin, and there's some debate about do they mean dried fruit and yada yada yada. Uh, why figs? There are later versions of a similar incense that show up in the Greek and Roman magical papyri and a number of other magical texts that came out of Egypt. And frequently, the magical incense that is used for invocation, for protection, to empower the magician, to accomplish a whole bunch of stuff, talks about figs. Figs were sacred to the Egyptians. There were connections to Osiris and also the goddess Hathor. Uh, Pharaoh was often sent to the afterlife with figs to nourish him along on his journey. And in one of the many visions of the Egyptian afterlife, there would come a point where the soul of Pharaoh would come to the edge of the desert, and a fig tree, particularly the Ficus sycamoris, so the sycamore fig, uh, this very sacred fig tree would be waiting for him, and the goddess Hathor would step out of it and give him food and give him drink and nourish him and nurture him. So we want a little bit of that nourishing and nurture in this. Uh, and figs and fig trees have all kinds of sacred connections in mythologies around the world. If you follow Folklore Thursday on Twitter or other locations, I believe it's Shanahan, there was a 2017 one that was devoted to the figs specifically that I'm pretty sure you can still Google whack and see that figs were pretty cool all over the place, including the sacred fig tree in Buddhism that sheltered the Buddha under the Bodhi tree as he achieved his grand revelation that gave birth to Buddhism. Now, the first thing I got to say about figs is, well, they look pretty funny. I mean, fresh or dried, but by funny I mean like they are these little sacks of stuff that are just all seeds on the inside.
They're so delicious.
And yeah, so they've got. If you are not familiar or used to this fruit, it is a very weird looking thing. Many of us over here in the States have probably eaten fig Newtons at some point or another, and I'm going to guess that's probably the extent of most of our exposure to figs. There's a whole bunch of different types of figs. These are Turkish figs. I wanted to go with Turkish figs because they are, at least in the region, from what the Egyptians would have had access to, the fruit of the sycamore fig would probably be better. However, those trees are incredibly rare, and they actually can only bear fruit if they are fertilized by a very particular wasp that they have a symbiotic relationship with. And lacking the wasp, they do not sexually reproduce. They do not make more fruit. So anyway. They are a pretty neat tree, though. There's a lot of lore that goes in with that particular thing. And I apologize for any horrible screeches that this might make on my... What? Well, I'm trying to be real careful so it's not just metal on marble.
So, question, is there a difference between a base for incense and a binder?
Not really, that I'm aware of. I mean, this is the agent. So the dried fruit, the honey, and the wine is in this style of incense, like what you are putting all of the scents into. I would say that in this case, the fruit and the wine and the honey are also chosen because they themselves do add some scent to it, as well as fixative qualities. The fruit will help the scent like stay and intensify over time. The only thing is that making incense in this style, it's not what most of our incense is. It's not how most of our incense is made these days. Certainly not for Western consumption. And so we're not really accustomed to burning it the way that it needs to be burnt. Like, we're used to incense that you can just stick directly on a charcoal, or that you can light up and you get it hot and it burns because it is smoldering. Um, it's a hot coal, and that is releasing the incense scent at a very high temperature. And this particular type of incense is meant more for a lower heat and a slower sort of simmering release of the scent. It was renowned in the ancient world for its complexity, many subtle nuances of flavor, sort of, and scent stacked on top of one another. And one of the benefits with burning it properly means that you get like the full experience of it. Oh, sticky stuff.
So much chopping.
Yeah.
Oh, I need to remember to. I should drop that new page we made for your website into the chat so people can check it out.
Hey, yeah, you've been working
so
on it
much
feverishly all day.
Clickety clackety. All right, here we go. Incense.
I also want to take a moment to point out that, this is Egyptian incense. The mythology I'm drawing upon is Egyptian. Egypt, and this probably goes without saying, is in Africa. And so there's a lot of important history and connections that one should probably look into. This is not a white people's thing, certainly not exclusively. So I want to point out that Egypt back in the day was called Kemet. It means black land because the soil after the Nile floods was black and rich. And black was not in that culture in any way a negative color. It was the color of life and fecundity, the color of the soil that nurtured a flourishing civilization that lasted for thousands of years. And that has had an influence on Western culture and especially Western magic that we continue to feel all the way down to the present time. But it would be disingenuous of me to pretend that this was not something connected to cultures other than that of my ancestors.
Okay, we've got a couple questions.
Yep.
Michelle, did your grandmother make this incense?
Nope. My grandmother was Irish, and so actually the one like magical thing I learned from my grandmother had nothing at all to do with Egypt or Egyptian stuff. It was actually with fairy lore. So her side of the family, I'm never 100% sure because it's been a very long time since Aunt Rita told me the stories. If my grandmother and her siblings were first generation Americans or second, it gets a little hazy for me. It's been a very long time since I talked to any of them, and they're all dead now, so I can't find out for sure. But anyway, that side of the family, my grandmother's maiden name was Mahoney. So most of what I learned from that side of the family was don't fuck with fairies, treat those things with respect. And there is a recipe that I have, which is for spice cakes. And these were cakes that we very occasionally would make. And there were a couple of rules about these cakes. Like, you made them, you did not eat them. They were made exclusively as offerings for the fae. And they usually went out with a little honey and a little milk, ideally cream, but you couldn't always get cream, so whole milk worked just fine. And they would be left as far as you could go in the backyard to like where it started to get wild. And, ideally leave them at like a stump or something. And that was to appease them, to just sort of let the fairies, which are basically elementals or nature spirits, know that you're thinking about them, that you're cool with them, that you want them to be cool with you back. And it was usually something we would do around the fall, not necessarily strictly on like Halloween or anything. But I don't know, I've since heard from other folks who have a similar heritage that was not an unusual thing, and it wasn't unique just to my family.
Question about burning Kyphi.
Yeah.
What should I use to burn it if I don't have a Bakur burner?
Okay. An easy hack would be a hot plate And if that is something that you don't have access to, I mean, they're fairly cheap though, you can rig something. If you have charcoal that you normally burn incense over, the one thing I will say is do not burn the Kyphi directly on the charcoal, especially not while the charcoal is red hot. What you will end up with is something that smells scorched like burnt sugar. There's a very high sugar content in the Kyphi, even in this variation. So what you want to be able to do is, if you only have a charcoal to burn it over, let the charcoal burn for a while so it's cooler, or kind of get some tinfoil and rig like a little stand over your charcoal so you have like a little cup and maybe about that much space so that you can cook it over it. Some people have had pretty good results also with, there are incense burners where there's like a little bowl and a stand, and you put like a little tea light under there. And my only warning with that is make sure you line the bowl with something, tinfoil preferably, because the Kyphi, as it cooks, because it's more cooking than it's burning, will get like this kind of hard, goopy, resiny mass, and it's very hard to clean up without just kind of pulling it off with the tinfoil. Talking about goopy, resiny masses, I have a lot of figs stuck to my fingers.
A fantastic tip.
Yes.
Someone's mom is sharing a friendly FYI about cutting on marble.
Yes.
It ruins the knife blade.
Oh
Makes it curl.
no. Okay, well that's good to know. I only have oh, that's right. Where'd the wooden one go? Because I was using a wooden one the last time.
Yeah, you were. It's a good
That's
question.
that's
It's probably
I
with
just
all the other.
Yeah, the thing was is I just didn't want to use my plastic. I did not
Oh yeah.
like that's the rule was I don't want to use plastic on any of this. And these are kind of expensive knives, so thank you for the tip.
Yeah, that hadn't even occurred to me.
I mean, I was being careful not to actually like.
Yeah, you seemed
Yeah.
like you were doing stuff really gently, but
Very gently
Whoa.
because it was making some noise.
New thing.
Okay, well I have
How
to.
much?
Okay, give me a moment
Sure.
because there's sticky stuff everywhere.
I can take that guy.
Yep, it's heavy.
I'm strong.
All right, cool. Yay! Found the thing I was missing. All right, I still need to chop a couple of these up, so let's
All right.
do. But chopping more ingredients means I have more questions I can take.
Yeah.
So in the recipe, as it is converted from the Temple of Edfu, you need 2 cups of dried fruit, either 2 cups of raisins, or in this case I'm doing half and half, and having golden raisins and figs. I expect the figs, so the when I did dates the first time, the dates lent it this very rich, earthy, syrupy scent as one of the bottom notes. Because one of the things that's interesting about this, in perfume making, now notably this is not perfume making strictly, but the order in which you add ingredients has an impact on the final scent. And there's a really good book on the sacred luxuries of ancient Egypt. It's called Sacred Luxuries. It's by Lise Manish. And she talks about there's this process you're doing for Kyphi. You make it and you are letting it stand day after day and adding like usually a couple of ingredients a day. And there is an order to that. She suggests that, especially since you're doing this in a copper vessel, that there is some chemical reaction going on, not to the extent of perfume, but it does have an impact. Like what goes in first is creating the base notes, and what goes in last is going to create some of the higher notes, like the first thing you smell. And I will say that that definitely holds true. In standard Kyphi, the last thing you add is myrrh. And certainly the first thing you smell when you burn it is that myrrh, is that sort of like bitter, resiny scent. And then it starts to just deepen to these earthier, warmer, very syrupy sweet. You smell the honey and you smell the fruit. And it just has many layers to the scent, which is another reason why, like, I pretty much harp on what's the best way to burn this. I mean, you could burn it over charcoal, but why would you?
So spoil it.
And it really, like, it does not smell good when it's burnt too hot.
No, it smells like anything that you've dropped. Like if you're cooking a dessert over
Yeah.
an open fire and something sizzles and burns. Like it just smells burned.
Yeah.
So no.
Now, the other handy thing about burning it at lower temperatures is that you don't get as much smoke. Actually, you get very, very minimal smoke. So if you are in a place where you are not allowed to have incense because of the smoke, or like me, you are sensitive to things like smoke, then burning it in the more traditional style is a lot more sustainable. I've also found that that lower that lower point of heat is really good for pretty much any of your resin incenses. So if you are fond of frankincense or myrrh or benzoin or copal, and you want those to last for quite some time, but for like maximum scent, no, it's okay, I won't cut myself, I promise. Then I recommend trying burning them at these, basically simmering them over something. Each of them has a different temperature point. And if you get, there's a place I've been recommending to people, Mermaid, MADE, Magical Arts, and they have a burner that has a little dial on it, and you can choose how hot or how cool that you want it to be. You can play with sort of like the melting point of them and get some really interesting results. All right, so that is the fix. I already measured the golden raisins. For the last vintage of Kyphi, I used red flame raisins, and for this one, because I want a little bit of that solar energy that's part of the full moon, that's part of the protective stuff, I want golden raisins. Now, some of these choices are purely me. Like, this is just me going, what would be a good symbol for the kind of energy that I'm pulling in here. Several of the other choices are informed by mythological statements, some traditional magic, and I will kind of go into all of that like as we go along from thing to thing. But what I will tell you is, why golden raisins? Because I said so.
Question, do you also add saffron at any point?
No, and there is no traditional recipe that has mentioned saffron. Now, there are references to types of crocus. Saffron is, the stamens from a crocus, but in those they seem more likely to be talking about the rhizomes of the plant. So sweet flag or calamus root. And we know that that is used as a fixative, both in perfume and in incense making. I believe that there are a couple of places that kind of debate, like, did they really mean calamus root with sweet flag, or are they talking about saffron? So I think there might be a couple of people who argue that that's actually saffron. But in any of my research and all of the sources that I've found to be most reliable, saffron is not what they suggest that ingredient is. Now, the hard part is we don't really know 100% what some of the ingredients are. We've got best guess scenarios, but there's a couple of hurdles to that. Some of it is the words that we used to describe some of these plants, some of their names have changed over time. In much the same way that, like, the incense name, Capet, which was the original name, just meant incense. Like it wasn't necessarily the specific type of incense that was burned in the evening. It seems like over time it developed to indicate that particular incense, and then frankincense by itself and myrrh by itself became more unique. But there's a couple of other ingredients also that are we're not sure. We've got a thought of what they could be and what they probably were, but it's oh, is there an archaeoastrology equivalent of like archaeo incense making? Because that's pretty much what this is. Or archaeobotany, really.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like archaeoastronomy is only possible because so much of it was like built into structures that stayed over, you know, hundreds, thousands of years. And I mean, this incense, like the recipe managed to stick around for about 2,000 years.
It's because it's so sticky.
Yeah. And it makes sense that so much of this stuff would be lost because, I mean, plants change and evolve. And
well, and you end up with different varieties.
yeah, and names for them all change.
Yeah. A bunch of the names. The one thing that makes it easier with the ancient Egyptians than maybe with some other cultures is the ancient Egyptians were like Audubon Society level of specific when they were reproducing plants and animals in their art. So you can identify the exact species of fish, of plant, of critter based on what they're drawing. It also makes the things, when they are just sort of making shit up, really stand out as this never existed in the natural world.
Here's a fun question.
Yeah.
How or what drove your interest in making and researching Kyphi?
Well, I have had a long-standing fascination with ancient Egypt, but this process, this whole kind of almost obsessive research project started based on a conversation I was having with a student, and we were talking about scent as a memory trigger. I know a number of people who feel that they've got ties to temples, ancient Egyptian temples, and I kind of theorized, like, well, what would a past life regression be like if you had a scent in the background that was probably something from that time period? And since we've been talking about Egypt specifically, Kyphi came up. And, you know, my thing with that was I'm like, but I've heard so many conflicting things about, like, what goes into it and everything. And, like, all the stuff that I found on the market just doesn't really quite hit me in a way I would expect it to. And at that point, I just started going down the rabbit hole and researching a lot. Okay, I think this is all mashed up. Thank you for saving my knife as much as you could. Hopefully you're good. Poor little knifey. Because this is my favorite one. I cook a lot with it. It is my best little chopper. Okay. I'm actually going to move my best little chopper over here for future washing.
A wise plan, methinks.
All right. And in comes the next, well, almost. I have too many things over here. Okay. Pardon me while I move some of the figs out of my way. Hey, guess what, hon? You'll have more figs to eat.
Excellent. I am here for you.
Okay. So,
fear not.
In addition to, like, acquiring all of the stuff that goes into the Kyphi, when I went on this wild ride of figuring out how to make this stuff, I had to buy a couple of key pieces of equipment. The most notable one being this really big pot of hand-forged, unlined copper. Every one of the things talking about Kyphi made in the ancient world talks about how it is prepared and boiled in copper pots. And why copper? There is a chemical reaction that goes on. It's the same reason why we don't use copper for cooking vessels, especially for anything that's got any kind of acid in it, even a little bit acidic, because there's stuff that will leach into your food. In this case, we want this to leach into the Kyphi. It has an effect on how this stuff soaks up and changes with the wine and with the honey. And then I have a second copper vessel for the point at which several days from now, you will get to watch me very slowly and laboriously melt, not frankincense this time, but a precious resinous gum into honey, and then add it to the Kyphi mash that has been getting like built up and added to over the course of multiple days. So right now, I'm just gonna go. Boop. Oh, I hate sticky things. Have I mentioned that to all you?
Oh. Yeah.
So there is 1 cup of figs.
Yes. There's a question that I can answer actually.
Yes.
Will this video be posted later on? Yes, it will.
Yes.
It will not necessarily be posted on. No, it will be posted on YouTube because
Yeah.
it's a live video.
Yeah. So like it'll
Yes.
end up on. If you need to walk away, this is being archived. It'll be up on my Facebook and also on my YouTube.
Yeah.
And I think I had an escapee of a little bit of raisins, so.
Ozzy.
No, they can't eat that.
They can't eat
Grapes,
raisins?
grapes are bad for cats.
Really?
Yes.
Well, it's a good thing I don't share my raisins.
Yes.
Or my grapes.
Grapes and raisins, onions. There's a bunch of things. Cats are very, very finicky with what they've got. Really delicate livers and kidneys. So,
Yeah.
like, coming over here and sticking his nose on it probably wouldn't kill him. Certainly wouldn't kill him. But I would prefer that he not. All right. At this point, I'm just get it off me. Get it off me. It is very sticky.
Great. The person who was asking about the videos being posted does not, in fact, have to go. They were just hoping they'd be able to watch again later.
Yeah. Yeah, especially if there's like notes and stuff that you want to take. Because I know that I would just kind of ramble all over the place on stuff.
It is funny. I was thinking about like how to describe the Kyphi videos to anyone.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, it starts out with incense, but then it goes to literally everything else. Like silliness, healing, insight, ancient mythology.
Ah, there it is.
Oh, you found the reason.
I did.
Occasionally I knock the camera over.
That happened.
You can't plan for that.
Okay, so I am gonna rinse my hands off here. Feel free to ask questions and stuff. I need to be less sticky. Is it imperative? I don't know if it's like a personal texture quirk I came into the world with, or if it is a holdover from the 5 years I spent in hospitals, but because let me tell you that the stuff they would hook you up to heart monitors with was just incredibly sticky. It'd just take you forever to get it back off. Okay, so we have raisins and figs, all golden and funny looking. And today we'll have one more key ingredient getting added in. Now, typically it asks for sweet red wine and oasis wine. And kind of in keeping with the color we've got going here, I am going to switch that to honey wine, to mead. There are a number of Kyphi blends that you will find out there where specifically they use honey mead by choice. But honey wine makes a lot of sense also for the Egyptian tradition. Honey and bees were sacred. Honey was used widely in Egyptian medicine, in pretty much everything. And we sort of want to bring in that healing power, or at least the symbolism associated with it. And I have had the honey sitting out under the light of the rising moon.
Ooh, exciting. Is it time for me to go?
Yeah, if you could
Yeah?
run off and
Okay.
grab that.
All right, I'll be back. If anybody has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I will find them when I return.
Yeah, so this is a mix of solar and lunar symbols and things in the different uh, recipe that I've cobbled together here. And there's a couple of reasons for it, and not simply for uh, pulling in the story of Set and that idea of protection during the dark hours, but in my own tradition, in the dark side of the year, the person who stands on that side is the sun at midnight. And Set kind of connects to that for us, Horus, to the person who stands on the light side of the year. And that theme of the sun at midnight, that we have solar things in a nighttime incense, and that we have lunar things also, stuff that's associated with the moon, is part of pulling together the complexity that represents this powerful deity from way back when, or at least the egregore thereof. And yeah, this smells like a dry one.
It smells delicious.
Well, you'll have to have some of it.
Oh, darn.
No. So
there are a
yeah.
couple of questions.
Okay.
One is just clarifying, sitting under the rising moon, what does that mean?
So in witchcraft and a number of related traditions, there are ways that you charge and cleanse crystals and water, and you place it underneath the light of the full moon, in most cases for the whole night. For me, it was more the symbolic gesture of doing it, and also to try to catch a little bit of the energy of that eclipse that's going on right now. Or really, in my case, more the concept of it, the feel for it. For witches, when they make moon water by putting water out underneath the light of the full moon, part of the goal is to then use that for cleansing. I know of people who also use it to anoint their, like the statues of their gods and goddesses. They may use it in tinctures or potions. But symbolically, you're taking the power, the energy that is associated with the full moon, and the water is soaking it up. It becomes a vessel for that. Some ways, think of it as like witchy transubstantiation, for those of you who might be, have a Catholic background, where, you have this ritual where very ordinary stuff is transmuted into something sacred.
So, with all the batches of Kyphi that you've made, are any of them identical to each other?
So, nope. Even when I've used exactly the same recipe, they don't turn out the same way. And some of that is, the stuff ends up being sourced from different places. The frankincense is different, and Kyphi is such a subtle blend of scents that if I have frankincense from Oman versus frankincense from India versus frankincense from Yemen, it changes the overall scent in the end. If my myrrh is Arabian myrrh, or if it's myrrh from Ethiopia, it has a different scent. It's subtle, but with this particular incense, it's those subtleties that make the whole thing come together. And so it's why I started calling them vintages. So each batch that I handcraft is its own little thing.
So, off topic.
Yep.
Except that there's not really an off topic.
Yeah, no, there's no off topic.
What do you think about EVP recordings?
I'm honestly on the fence about them. I've heard a few that I can definitively go, something is up there. But I learned about EVPs back in like fourth or fifth grade, I took parapsychology as like an extracurricular thing. That's a long story. I had a really weird school system, and some really amazing opportunities. But so I was, for the longest time, hesitant to sort of endorse the idea of EVPs because I just wasn't sure how a spirit's voice would be recorded by something that is designed to record the human voice. It feels to me, from my experience, they tend to communicate in a very different way, not in ways that necessarily translate to literally a voice. So, on the occasions that I hear a spirit talking, it's perception with like an inner ear, clairaudience, if you will. And I don't feel like that's a voice that somebody could necessarily capture on a piece of equipment. Now, that aside, there have been a few instances where the equipment itself almost seems to become a channel for some other way of communicating, some other way of being recorded. So I'm willing to allow that spirits can sometimes influence technology to achieve what they want. And one of the times that was like most telling to me that there was definitely something going on, that it was definitely almost a kind of mediumship or channeling, and this recording device just happened to be the best focus for the person using it, was when I did an investigation with Mark and Debbie Constantino. And if you know their story, it's an incredibly tragic one. And this was about a year before all of that played out. I'd heard mixed things about them. And, you know, as the internet is, like everybody's always got an opinion about stuff. And I didn't really know them, and I try to reserve my own judgment about anybody working in the paranormal for how do I see them in action? Like, what have I witnessed with my own eyes? Like, I don't like to say this person is real or a fake definitively without being able to go, I literally watched them do X, Y, or Z. And so I was sitting next to Debbie in, I think, what's called it's a room that is sort of erroneously associated with like being a chapel, I think, in Shawshank, Mansfield Reformatory. And so we were trying to get a response from the spirits without provocation. I'm not a fan of provocation. So what I offered to do was read some prayers in Latin on the theory that the spirits of people who had been incarcerated for severe crimes were going to have one of two fairly intense reactions to that. Either they would be attracted to the prayers because they did feel some sort of remorse or some opportunity for redemption, or they were still very set in their ways and angry and bitter because there were a number of folks who had, at least on the surface, had performative Satanism that they were playing around with in their cells. And what I will say is she was sitting right next to me. It was dark, but not so dark that it was impossible to see. And I was close enough to have heard if she was whispering at it or anything like that. Like I felt confident that if she was going to fake something, I would have picked up on it. And so we're doing that. I'm reading my thing, keeping an eye on her because I'd heard stuff. And she stops once we're done and plays back. And clear as day, like the clearest EVP I've ever heard was, "Someone shut that fucking bitch up." So, and the thing was, is I had felt as a psychic, as a medium, and this is maybe an unfair way of judging people's EVPs, but I'd felt that emotion around that time. When I work with Adam Kimmel and Becker Kirschbaum and the folks that are connected with Madison Seminary, the MAD crew, and RU Paranormal, frequently when they're doing their EVP sessions, they will have me listen with my psychic senses and have a notebook and like write down what I think is happening and being said as they are recording. And because they're very careful to timestamp everything, then we match it up. And it is interesting that for some people, there seems to be a way in which they react best with EVP and digital recordings as kind of a way of channeling or almost mediumistically communicating with spirits. And the few EVPs that I've heard that I'm like, yes, something is going on, what got played back was very close to, if not identical to, what I'd heard when they were recording it, but just not with my physical ears. So, so I think there's something there. I also think that there's an awful lot of static that is mistaken for something.
Cool. Switching tactics.
Yeah.
Avery says, I think Neith, Neith,
Neith, yeah.
The deity for the bee. Do you know how that connection came about?
See, I'm not sure that she actually is the thing. She's connected with weaving and wrappings. I'd want to dig a little bit more. She's one of the goddesses that I don't have a lot of information about. For various reasons, I've spent a lot of time digging around into mythology regarding Set and Horus. She comes up here and there, but I don't feel confident saying yes or no on that. I have not run across a specific myth tying her to that, and that doesn't mean there isn't one, it just means that I haven't read it yet. If you have a place where you've seen that connection, and you can, like, point me in that direction, I will track it down and say definitively one way or the other. I mean, one of the things that's really complicated and difficult with ancient Egyptian mythology is they had hundreds of gods. Hundreds. And like there's the ones that we probably are most familiar with, which would be Osiris and Isis, Thoth, and all of these names are actually the Anglicanized versions of the Hellenized versions of the Egyptian names. So there's some telephone going on with how you pronounce these. Anubis. Oh, let's see. Ra, who is sometimes presented as Amun-Ra, but actually that is a marriage of two different deities, Amun and Ra. Ptah, and I'm pronouncing it that way so you know it starts with P-T-A-H. So if you see that, you're not looking for Ta, T-A. The Ogdoad. So basically there's this family of gods and goddesses that are a generation or two removed from a couple of the creation myths. So at first there's First there's Ra. There's the first guy who shows up, at least in the creation myth as it appears at Edfu, and he just sort of rises out of formlessness and nothingness. And because he's lonely and he wants things to happen and the world to be around, he basically masturbates Shu and Tefnut into existence. And then Shu and Tefnut end up having Jeb and Nuit, if I am remembering correctly. We will see Jeb stretching as a man who is green, stretching on the ground underneath the arched body of the sky, Nut or Nuit. And all of these, well, certainly Nui, who may be remembered in the French word for night. I'm not even sure, honestly. If you were to dial back into the ancient world where there is no light pollution, and you looked into the sky as the Milky Way rose on the horizon, from our perspective here, in the way in which we look down that part of our galaxy, there is a sort of rippling dark space in the center of this river of stars. And if you look just right at it, it looks like a woman's body. It has a very feminine shape to it, and you can see the suggestion of that hourglass figure and her arms outstretched and her legs. So there's a lot of interesting conjecture about how the gods and goddesses, especially the earliest ones, were anthropomorphizations. Basically, they were personifications of things that they saw in the world. So the sky and the earth, Shu and Tefnut are connected to moisture and air.
So there's an interesting profusion of questions.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. So
there really is. Let's see. Okay, and they're all sort of going different directions, so I'll just start at the top.
Yeah, pick a direction for me.
So, do you think it would be possible to make an essential oil out of this recipe if you used a carrier oil instead of wine, or some other approach?
I've considered that. One of the things that's difficult with trying to make an essential oil for the Kyphi, and it's why I keep experimenting with different batches, is trying to figure out like what can I change, what can I omit that still has the overall scent, because like frankincense, you can get essential oil for that. Myrrh, you can get essential oil for that. Those are pretty simple. But there's a couple of other things that we don't make essential oil for. Now, if you happen to have the equipment to do it yourself, maybe, because there's one of the, in my opinion, key ingredients in classic Kyphi, at least the Edfu stuff, is something called nut sedge or cyperus grass. Ironically, they sell a lot of nut sedge killer over at the local hardware store because it's deemed a pest out here. But it has these little rhizomes that are about yay big. They look kind of like weird little dried out cocoons, at least in the form that I get them. And they have this myrrh and anise-like earthy medicinal scent. It is incredibly rich, and it's one of the first things that goes into the Kyphi mash. And I think that it's one of the key notes to the scent. And I actually, I know for sure, I have not found any place where you could find the essential oil for that. Would you be able to potentially use a substitution? Yeah. But I don't know anything that matches it. I've never smelled anything quite like it. So the question would come down to what of the main notes of the scent can you keep and still call it Kyphi that would allow for the creation of an oil, and to my satisfaction, from having made it from made it from scratch based off of what's on the walls of the temple, I haven't come up with what would be a good solution yet.
Okay. So, again,
yeah,
90 to 120 degree turn. How do ghosts or spirits project energy for us to hear them in person? I know there are some residual hauntings or imprints, but how does it work when multiple people are hearing the same thing or getting the same impression?
Well, spirits, I will preface this by saying this is my belief. It is based off of my perceptions and my experiences, as well as a copious amount of research. And I'd definitely point you in the direction of Roger Thurman's introduction to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, because it's got some of the most insightful stuff into how spirits work that you wouldn't expect if you were just looking for stuff in paranormal texts. Spirits are energy. And I mean, you and I, we are body and energy. We are spirit beings that are like mashed into this meat suit, and the physical world is incredibly distracting, but we operate on that level as well. We communicate with one another, we exchange energy with one another, we just simply tend not to notice it. Well, remove this, and it's really hard not to notice. So spirits, especially the human dead, are beings of energy. They need to interact with energy to maintain themselves, to have enough power in order to do things. And when they communicate, they are communicating with empathy, with telepathy. They are doing the sorts of ways the sorts of things that we do to communicate with one another over a distance. Only they have to figure out pretty quickly how to do it intentionally. Otherwise, they can't communicate at all. So think of it like this. Every one of us is like a radio tower, but also a radio receiving tower. Some of us are tuned to a lot of frequencies. Some of us, maybe our battery's running low and we don't have enough juice to like really catch a lot. but spirits are communicating on the frequencies that most of us are capable of receiving. It's just a matter of, can we translate it? Do we have enough bandwidth to hear it on a conscious level? And have we trained ourselves to interpret accurately what we are receiving when we are receiving it? I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I feel like the method of transmission is one of those like sustaining mysteries.
Yeah. Is it Upton Sinclair? There's a book called Psychic Radio. Oh, I can't. So I always get confused with the fellow who wrote The Jungle.
That's Upton Sinclair.
Okay, and then another guy who was writing stuff at the same time.
I'm not going to be any help with that.
No, it's called Psychic Radio, and it is a deep dive into this fellow's wife who was a receiver, and a very accurate one. I'd also recommend look into the writings and work of early ghost hunter Harry Price.
Mm-hmm.
He had a book on poltergeists, and it was actually probably the first place I encountered the theory that when spirits are going to do something, whether it's move something, create a spiritual apport, an object that just sort of seems to appear out of nowhere, communicate with people, give them the sense of being touched, since these are non-physical beings that are trying to accomplish something in the physical world, Price suggested that requires a fair amount of energy, a good deal of power. And he further, from observing multiple hauntings and in cases, he was an investigator, a very prolific one. He had noticed two things. People who were living in the middle of very physical active hauntings tended to get very worn down. Like there was a sense that there was an energetic drain, and usually you could kind of feel this right before something acted out. I guarantee you, if you've gone on investigations, even just one, but probably more than one, because you've learned to recognize the sense, there's this point where the air gets tight and almost like there's an impending storm. You can feel it on a level that's visceral, just before something happens. But there's a buildup, almost like a crackling on the air, where it coalesces before there's the explosion. The other thing that he'd noticed was batteries tended to get drained around explosive moments of spirit activity, when there would be outbursts of physical expression, or something else that was basically crossing from spirit to the physical world, where they were affecting the physical world. And while he didn't think that they were necessarily getting power from draining the batteries, he did feel that there was some interference, something that they were causing, that the batteries were, the drain in the batteries, the drain on lights and electricity was a side effect of whatever that weird, tight, crackling thing is. We just don't know how to measure that. We can feel it.
Okay, so for once not taking a completely 90-degree turn,
yeah.
Can you suggest some ways to change our vibrational levels to be able to communicate with beings of those different levels that you talk about?
I feel like a broken record with this one, but do a little bit of work on your own energy. And the simplest way to do that is to first become aware of it. I recommend to people to do just 5 minutes in the morning, 5 minutes at night of just breathing. It's a simple meditation where you let your attention just go into your body. You let your breath kind of carry you from just the physical awareness to the sense of how the vitality moves throughout your whole body. And just become conscious and engaged in that flow as you feel it in your body. Give yourself 5 minutes, because I know we're all ridiculously busy. Beginning of the day, end of the day, wherever you can squeeze it in. And as you do just that little bit of work of becoming aware of your energy and becoming more consciously engaged in it, it increases the quality, it makes you more sensitive, it slowly builds up. You'll also build up your endurance, so you'll be able to do more work with it. You may find yourself tingling in an interesting way, especially around your hands, like a sense of warmth for many people, as you essentially like light up your energy body as you work with it. Reiki attunements can help with that. Pretty much any energetic tradition that you can start to work with, from Tai Chi, at least when it's taught as something that is both your energy and physical motion, yoga, and related techniques. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's out there right now that would give you different options for just becoming aware of not just your body, but what else is running around in it, and allow you to build that up, to become more conscious of it, to become more engaged with it. And the more you do that, the more sensitive you become. And ideally, whatever tradition you are working in will also help teach you what to do once you start to build that sensitivity, how to also kind of turn it off a little bit, how to protect yourself, how to pull in when you don't want to be sensitive, but also how to turn your perspective outward when you really want to hear whatever you can.
Interesting. So there's a question specifically about drumming, but I'm going to broaden it a tiny bit.
Okay.
The question is, so if you drum to build energy for your spiritual practice, and you happen to be doing that in a place with spiritual activity, could that energy be taken or used by spirits?
Yes, you can. So let's go back to witches and witchcraft. Witches, pagans particularly, when they're doing a ritual, and they cast something called a circle, really basic ones, they do this thing to like raise a cone of power, which the language sounds pretty weird if you're not familiar with it. But the idea of creating a sacred space, doing things to raise energy, you're not just doing that to like feel good. You are doing that as an offering to the spirits. You are doing that to facilitate their communication and their manifestation. You're doing that to create this rich environment that helps you as an embodied being also interact more closely on that side, partly by bringing it closer to you, by feeding it, by giving it more power. So dance and drumming and meditations, certain types of meditation, all of these are things that will raise energy. And one of the things to keep in mind if you're doing that, especially if your goal is to invite spirits and spirit communication, is be conscious and intentional with that. Be clear who or what you want to invite. Be clear how much of an offering you want to give them. Don't give them carte blanche. I will tell you right now, almost all of the spirits I work with, even the formerly human ones, are incredibly literal. So if you are just like, hi, I love you, take everything, you're probably going to find yourself with a hangover the next day. Not a drinking hangover, just a like, oh God, what did I do? So approach it with a certain amount of pragmatism. Set boundaries, be clear, communicate, be intentional. And practice a little bit with it. Like when you're raising energy, when you're drumming, I love drumming too. I love dance too. Like you can feel when it's starting to like just change the energy in a space. You can feel as it's risen and like it hits this certain point where you can keep sustaining it, or you can direct it somewhere. And that directing it, that's where you want to make a clear choice about, do I send this to people to heal? Do I send this to spirits because I want my ancestors to come and look over me, and I want to make sure that I help feed them and give them enough power that they can communicate back with me. So be pragmatic and have intent and set boundaries.
So if someone was hypothetically trying to get information about Heru-Ur or Horus the Elder,
Yeah.
where would be a good jumping off point?
Oh, Lord. It's scattered all over the damn place, and it makes me kind of crazy. Geraldine Pinch might be the first place to start. She's got a book on. Actually, I think it might be in the other room. One second.
Oh, bye.
I'll be right back.
Oh, classic. I'm about to come in there with the video.
I don't have. What do I do with Pinch's book? Oh, there she is. I'll be right back. This is why that table is covered in books. So,
That's why it's dangerous, because when they're downstairs, you don't go and get them.
Geraldine Pinch has.
Oh, can you angle it a bit more towards the light? No, other way. Yes, that's good. That's
Okay.
good. Cool.
Has that.
Actually, it's a lot easier to just
Okay,
this one.
Here we go.
Bigger screen.
Geraldine Pinch is the one I'd say to look up and start with.
Awesome. Good deal.
The thing is like that stuff. Set had some really shitty PR. And what you're going to find most of is the history of Set and Osiris much later, and Set with Horus the Younger. And so the contendings of Horus and Set tell a very different story, and Set has become at that point this sort of buffoon figure. He's the creepy pederastic uncle who wants to be pharaoh and is trying to keep Horus from being pharaoh, and he's already murdered and dismembered his brother Osiris, and it's a whole soap opera worth of like god and goddess bullshit going on. And it's a much later thing, but because it's much later, we have a lot more stuff that survived from it. Trying to peel all the way back to Horus the Elder and Set. I really like. There's a couple of bas reliefs and stela that have the two of them standing on the opposite of a pillar with a cord between them, representing these two polar forces. And there's echoes of it in a couple of the rituals. The Hebsed festival being a main one, but not nearly as much information, and I think maybe because it's just not as juicy of the whole contendings of Horus and Set, because I mean there's sodomy, there's like masturbating onto lettuce, like Set ends up having
I go somewhere else in my mind for 2 seconds and I come back and
no, I mean
know how it's
that,
always just a half step away.
But this mythology, like it is like whoa, the stuff that plays out. Like seriously, Isis at one point convinces Horus to seduce Set, and like there's a whole thing. It's just a mess.
That's amazing.
Then they like call Set in front of the gods to like see who buggered whom, and Horus.
Right, that whole.
Yeah, and Horus jacked
so
off on Set's lettuce, and Set ate the lettuce with the semen, and it was like, oh, whose semen is in whose mouth, and it like comes out of Set's forehead, and like it's weird stuff.
Check your lettuce before you eat it is what I'm getting from this. So here's an energy work question.
Yes, please,
really
let me stop talking about the peculiar
too.
sex lives of ancient Egyptian deities.
I mean, that could be a whole show by itself.
Oh, no, it's weird shit.
So how do you set boundaries in the present state versus the other world?
Well, I mean, I think it depends on what type of boundaries you're talking about. If we're talking like setting, okay, so yeah, I'm going to answer 2 questions there because there are technically 2 questions there. How do you set boundaries? Good emotional boundaries, like actually saying this far and no further, like just simply being very clear of, I would like to engage with you for this period of time, and here is the boundary at which we will be done. Or I will engage with you only in this room of my house, and I would prefer that you not communicate with me or touch me outside of it. Like being very clear of essentially the rules of engagement. And think of it like the rules that maybe you would set for a toddler. Not that you should think of spirits like toddlers, except when it comes to what they might be willing to do to push back to try to get what they want, because they're some of them can be pushy. So you need to be able to be clear. No, I'll talk to you, but only here. I'll do this, but only this far. When I give energy to you, it's only this amount. I'm not giving you everything I've got. So set those boundaries. Um, there is another answer about creating boundaries in your space, which kind of gets into warding, shielding, and psychic self-defense techniques, where you literally like go around a space and remind yourself that there are walls and there is a ceiling and that there is a floor, and this doesn't merely protect you from the physical elements, but can be a space that has spiritual existence, that energetically stands and can keep things out. So extending that, kind of merging those two, I mentioned only talk to me in this room of my house. You can create a space that you set aside as, this is where I go and do this stuff. This is where I go and talk to grandfather or great great aunt Susan, or my dead sibling. And because I have kids, or because I have pets, or because I have a family member who's just not all about it, I will keep it in this space. So first, before even talking with or trying to invite the spirit, spend some time in that space and kind of intentionally shape it for that purpose. How do you do that? There is the intent, just literally the energy of standing in that space, but also make it a space, make it comfortable for spirits. Like whoever you're trying to invite, if it's a relative, have some things that were important to them. If you don't have actual objects that were theirs, did they like a particular candy? Did they like a particular color? Do you always associate them with wearing a necktie? Like, have a couple of things in there that are richly reminiscent of them. And in your mind, make that a space where when I walk into this space, I'm ready to FaceTime with them. I am ready to communicate with them. And that warding, that like touching the walls and knowing you have a ceiling, you have a floor, and you have the walls, and you have, if not actually like a physical door, maybe a piece of cloth you can drape. Remind yourself that this is an enclosed space. Within these walls, this communication is both possible and allowed. Outside of these walls, we have to negotiate further. And that way you don't have, whoever you might be working with just sort of rambling around your house at night, going, can I talk yet? Can I talk? And I mean, you might be totally cool with that. I am mostly. But especially if you're just starting, set a little space aside. Be clear about when and where and how, and make it a space that is inviting, but also has a lot of rich cues, a lot of visual cues for you. So you also recognize this is where we have these conversations. This is where it is allowable and safe and controllable.
I'm going to take a tiny break on asking you questions so you can...
Yeah, well, actually, I'm just going to stick that over there. Get a clean...
Do you need a hand moving it?
No, it's not particularly heavy.
Okay. I am your beast of burden. If you need one.
Mostly I'm just moving stuff out of the way.
Oh, there's some, a few folks have commented on your shirt. They quite like it.
I'm fond of it.
Was that one of the ones that you designed?
Yes, actually.
Cool.
From forever ago.
We've come so far.
All right, so
Cool.
figs, raisins, and honey mead. Now, what'll happen is, well, realistically, tomorrow there's like one thing that needs to get added into there, and tomorrow is a pretty busy day. I've got a 2-hour class, and then a little break, and then a connection ritual,
and then probably more stuff.
Then possibly more stuff, and so I don't know that I will do a full live stream of adding this particular thing into it, but I will record for posterity what I'm doing. Um, if I were following the traditional Kyphi recipe as it appears on the walls of the Temple of Edfu, the ingredient tomorrow would be that nut sedge, cyperus grass that I had mentioned. There is a much later translation where instead of cyperus grass, they suggest that that is something called galangal. Galangal is another rhizome. It is related to cinnamon.
Oh, that's not the one that I was
No,
smelling
no.
smelling earlier.
No, this has sort of like a spice, cinnamon, warm.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
It's almost like peppery.
Yeah, peppery, but also has that earthy undertone.
Yeah.
And so like there is a later version that instead of cyperus grass, it's galangal. Given the fire associations that this particular stuff has, it will go in there to add in some more of the Setian sun at midnight protective vibe. And
exciting.
Yeah.
All right. Do you want to get one more fun question?
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to hold one question in either hand, and I want you to point to a hand.
Eeny, meeny, miny, that one.
All right, have you ever seen a werewolf?
I have met several people who identify as werewolves in the sense that I think those beings were originally intended in the same vein as berserkers and wargs. So let me, this requires a little bit of backstory. In Nordic countries, as well as in probably parts of Ireland and Scotland, particularly where there was some crisscross between with the Vikings and stuff, there was this belief that certain people, it's not exclusive to those areas, but it's definitely where our idea of the Werewolf, the werewolf and the berserker come from. There was a belief that certain people had the ability to send their spirit forth, and that spirit would appear as an animal, that they had this animal spirit in them, and they had many of the qualities of that animal. So a berserker, if you have heard that, berserker, it means bear skin, as in like bear rar. They were people, they were human beings who were believed to have the spirit of a bear. And it was something that they could call on. It made them very hardy, very ferocious, very protective. And this probably is a remnant of a shamanic, if not religion, at least path that we probably don't have a whole lot of stuff that has survived from when those areas were Christianized. And so, long story short, I have met a few modern people who feel that way, who feel that they have got that sort of I don't want to say two-spirit, that's a totally different thing, who have that animal spirit in them, that's their fetch, their power. And if they change form, it's more in an astral or a spirit realm. And do we want to like get into the messy territory of like, is this a totem spirit? Like, are we talking about totemic animals? I'm going to say that totem is Native American. Interestingly, at this point, I think we have proven there was some definite exchange going on between the Vikings and the Native Americans. And so, like, did one influence the other? Who knows? But what I can say is there was definitely Northern European beliefs that people had these animal spirits. Wolves and bears were primary ones. I think in some areas crows might have been another, or ravens specifically. They do not physically transform, and they nevertheless have this power, the spirit of that animal in them, and can appear in dreams to other people or in visions to other people as that animal. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
I have one more question.
Okay.
Okay, so it's a follow-up question to the one about boundaries and spirits. So my mother is deceased, and I want to go to her grave and ask her spirit to come back home with me, so I can connect daily without having to travel to the grave.
Mhm.
Do I need to go there to ask her, or how can I connect if I can't make it there?
Fun fact, the shape of our gravestones comes from ancient Egypt. So back in Egyptian days, if your mom was buried somewhere, like it was a haul to get there. Like it was a very very long trip, and so you did not get a chance to go to the tomb to to speak with the spirit. And at this point in time, like they had a very complicated funerary tradition, so you had to make regular offerings and things to your deceased loved ones to keep them happy. So what you would do is you had this little thing that looked an awful lot like our modern tombstones. And specifically, if you've ever seen the ones that have like the little winged death's head, like they've got like the little boop on top, wings death head, go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art online, go to the Cleveland Museum of Art online, poke around in their Egyptian collection. You will see that very familiar tombstone shape. And instead of a death's head, it is a solar disk and it has wings. And they would have this as basically the proxy for the tomb. So it was your telephone to the dead, more or less. Like that was the thing that represented it. So you didn't have to make that trip. So I was, without directly saying it, when I was saying set a place aside in your home and put a few things on it that remind you of the person you are trying to invite. I was describing basically that. I don't think that you need to go where she's buried. I think she can hear you just fine. Uh, and what you want to do is simply set a little place aside. It can be on a nightstand, it can be on a bookshelf, it can be a whole wall of a room if you want it to be, but have a few items that speak to you deeply about who she was to you. Let that be your item, your shrine, if you will, that serves as an anchor point for her spirit to find you. It's not the objects so much as the energy and the intent, the love and the invitation that accomplishes what you're trying to do. But because we're embodied beings, it helps us to have a physical thing to focus on. So having something there so that you can physically go to it and look at it and think about her and let that be the invitation, that is how you do that.
Fantastic.
And Illyria might be able to tell you about the one she made for her mom.
I mean, do we want to go in and see it?
Sure. I mean, we
Why not?
Yeah.
We can. I guess we'll have to carry a little bit of stuff, but yeah. Let's take an adventure. I'm going to turn the light on first.
Okay. I will carry this. That might be the easiest one.
Yeah, okay, so we're going to, what we're going to do
Is swap out.
is, oh yeah, I can just take you entirely out of the stream.
Mhm.
Okay,
Okay.
here we go.
Walk with us for a moment. We apologize for any shaky cam.
You're levitating. Come to the living room, everyone. So, yeah, so I had a similar.
How about I put this
Oh,
here?
goodness.
I will take this and you can tell the story.
Okay. So, so my mom passed away about six years ago now. And while I did not have the question about how to contact her spirit, at some point, about, I want to say 4 years ago, or no, 2 years ago, so 4 years after she had died, I started having all these dreams about my mom. And it was soon after I had sold her house. And the problem in my dreams was that my mom didn't have a place to stay. So my lovely Michelle suggested that I make an ancestor altar, and I was trying to figure out where it could go. Hi, Ozzy. But it's a great, lovely beast. And I wanted to make it somewhere that was, connected to the life of the home. So what we ended up doing was making this lovely mantelpiece into an altar. I guess this side
We
is
made the
technically
altar.
the altar.
We made the mantelpiece as well, by
That's
the way.
true. By hand, together. But yeah, so I picked things that reminded me of my mom, or were my mom's, like this lovely rainbow beret, which she wore all the time, despite the fact that it's plastic and not nearly as nice as lots of the jewelry she had, but you know, things that are meaningful, and a ring that she always wore, a little, actually that picture was of another eclipse.
Yeah, your mom was
the
super
total-
into eclipses,
Oh my gosh.
given how many pictures are around the house from them.
Yeah, but total solar eclipse from 1991 that we traveled to Hawaii to see,
Yeah.
so we could be in the path of totality. And yeah, I set up this space. I haven't really been having so many dreams about my mom not having a place to live ever since we made this little altar for her.
Well, and you don't have a lot of like clear perceptions of like voices or visions or anything, but there's that like
Yeah.
body feel that you'll get. That sort of like
Yeah.
like tingling pressure or something. And I know when you first set it up, you had mentioned something to that effect.
Like a very short person might be hugging me.
Yeah.
Yeah, sort of like that.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Cool.
So make a place for them. I know it's funny because like other when we call it an ancestor altar. You don't have to think of it as an ancestor altar. I mean, just we kind of make stuff like that for our deceased loved ones. It doesn't have to be, ancestor worship, just leaving a place for them to be.
And I will say it really does seem to make a big difference to them from what I've seen.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. So we have taken a little trip.
Yeah, and now we're back.
And if anybody was curious about the big statue that you could see out of the bottom corner, this sort of like feminine face looking thing, that was my mom's work.
Awesome. All right, we're literally only looking at your arm right now.
Okay, well, I don't know if you just turn that off or. There we go.
Basically, there we are. Yay! But I guess are we done?
Yeah, I think we're done.
Yeah. Everybody enjoyed the field trip from the scrolling of comments that I saw.
Yep.
But here, I'll do one of my favorite things is actually like doing the live stream and then
Yeah,
backing
and
up
being like, here, this is how the sausage is made.
Literally, I'm sitting next to a box of jars.
There's stuff
so many
everywhere.
Devices. Yep. So
Pine resin, lemongrass, opopanix, like 5 different varieties of frankincense, Google gum, the galangal.
So many.
This is the like cheap Kyphi trying to like dry out, and it's totally not doing any kind of job with that. This is pine resin we collected from a friend's pine tree down in Columbus before all the riots broke out. Actually, the day the stuff happened. Yikes.
Ooh, this just got meta because I'm looking at. Oh, there's so many layers.
Yep.
All right. Well, good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you for being here with us. And I'm sure we'll see you again soon, probably Sunday, if I'm remembering the schedule right.
And hey, remember, none of us are free until all of us are free.